Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we're taking a look at a black-green deck called Scion Sacrifice. It's a very grindy mid-range deck that relies on a lot of cheap expendable creatures, so we can get into the late game and exploit those creatures by sacrificing them, gain some advantage, and then we've got a lot of card advantage built into the deck so that we can win the late game as well. So let's get started here with our 1-drops, where we have a Blistterpod, one of the centerpieces of the deck. So it's just a 1/1 for 1 mana, but when Blistterpod dies, we get a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature token, which we can also sacrifice at instant speed to add a colorless mana to our mana pool. But basically the idea is to get 2 creatures out of just the 1, so we pay for 1 mana and then we get access to 2 creatures that we can sacrifice over the course of the game, which is very powerful in this deck that wants to be sacrificing a lot of creatures. Then we've got Bonesplinters, which is the removal spell of choice in this deck, very mana efficient at just 1 black mana. And as an additional cost to cast Bonesplinters, we do have to sacrifice a creature, so that's why all those cheap expendable creatures are so important. But then we do get to destroy target creature, so no conditions, so no matter how big the opponent's creature is, we can just take it out with single mana from Bonesplinters. Then we've got a Carrier Thrall, which is just the larger version of a Blistterpod, so for 2 mana we get a 2/1 instead of a 1/1, and when the Thrall dies we also get the same Eldrazi Scion creature token. We've also got 2 copies of a Rot Shambler, which is one of the win conditions in the deck, since whenever a creature we control dies, we can put a +1/+1 counter on Rot Shambler, so he can grow out of control pretty quickly since we are sacrificing a lot of creatures. We can also sacrifice those Eldrazi Scion creature tokens at instant speed, so we can kind of use it as a combat trick in combination with the Rot Shambler. So very powerful card, but we don't want to have too many copies since we also do need to have those creatures we can sacrifice, since we don't really want to sacrifice the Rot Shambler. Then we've got 4 copies of Elvish Visionary, another cheap expendable creature we can sacrifice, but the Visionary replaces itself since when she enters the battlefield we get to draw a card, so a nice card to have. Then we've got 1 copy of Shadows of the Past, which is a very powerful enchantment in this deck, since whenever a creature dies we get to scry 1, so this helps us dig for those critical cards we need, since we will be sacrificing a lot of creatures, so we get to scry a bunch, and then later in the game for 4 and a black we can make the opponent lose 2 life and gain 2 life ourselves, but we do need to have 4 or more creatures in our graveyard in order to activate this. But that shouldn't be a problem since we have a lot of creatures that will get sacrificed, and those will end up in our graveyard. We also have 2 copies of Evolutionary Leap, which is a very powerful sacrifice outlet in this deck. So for a single green mana and sacrificing a creature, we get to reveal the top cards of our library until we reveal a creature card, and then we can put that creature card into our hand. So you can see how all those cheap creatures that replace themselves can be pretty powerful with the Evolutionary Leap, since we can keep sacrificing them, keep sacrificing those Eldrazi Scion tokens, and keep drawing into more and more creatures until eventually we have enough creatures to just kill the opponent with. We also have Liliana, Heretical Healer, which is a super synergistic card in this deck. So we get a 2/3 lifelinker, and whenever another non-token creature we control dies, we can transform Liliana, and we also get a 2/2 black zombie creature token when she transforms. And when she is a planeswalker, we can +2 to make each player discard a card. We can minus an amount to return a non-legendary creature from our graveyard into play. And then the ultimate is also pretty sweet in this deck, since then we get to keep returning cards from the graveyards into play, so goes nicely with all the sacrifice themes we've got going on. We also have 2 copies of Fleshbag Marauder, which is another very synergistic card. When the Fleshbag enters the battlefield, each player has to sacrifice a creature, and we have a lot of expendable creatures that we can sacrifice. Is a little less powerful than it used to be, since now a lot of people are playing the ramp decks and just have a lot of Gatecreeper Vines laying around, but still a very powerful card. Then we've got another sacrifice outlet here in Nantuko Husk, 3 mana for a 2/2, which seems pretty bad, but the ability here is very powerful since we can sacrifice a creature at instant speed to give the Nantuko Husk +2/+2 until end of turn, so your opponent always has to respect the possibility of just you sacrificing a bunch of creatures to the Husk, which can just kill the opponent out of nowhere. And also very powerful with all those Blistterpods, for example, since those give the Husk 2 creatures that can get sacrificed. We're also playing a Nissa just as a good value creature that can also transform into a Planeswalker to provide some card advantage. Another very synergistic card in the deck is Smothering Abomination, 4 mana for a 4/3 flyer. At the beginning of our upkeep we do have to sacrifice a creature, but that usually isn't a problem, and whenever we do sacrifice a creature we get to draw a card. So basically with the Abomination in play we get to draw 2 cards on our upkeep and draw step. And then whenever we sacrifice another creature, so that also includes sacrificing Scion tokens for mana, we get to draw a card. Also very powerful in combination with the Nantuko Husk, since in response to our sweeper, the Nantuko Husk allows us to just sacrifice all our creatures to draw a bunch of cards, so that we have a full hand when the sweeper resolves. So just a very powerful card in the deck. We also have 2 copies of Eyeless Watcher, which is another card that makes Scion tokens, so we get a 1/1 and 2 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature tokens, which is again very good in this deck since that's a lot of ways to sacrifice our creatures, and also at instant speed. We also have 2 copies of From Beyond, which is just a slower version. This one just pumps out a 1/1 Scion token on our upkeep every turn. The other text here is not relevant since we're not playing any large Eldrazi. We also have 2 copies of Priest of the Blood Rite, which is another very powerful win condition in the deck. So we get a 2/2 and then a 5/5 flyer as a token. At the beginning of our upkeep the Priest does lose us 2 life, but we can just simply sacrifice the 2/2 part and keep the 5/5 flyer around, which is very strong. And then finally we also have Ob Nixilis as another removal spell and card advantage engine, which is also very strong in the deck. And then our mana base, 9 swamps, 8 forests, 2 cemeteries, and then 4 guildgates for some good mana fixing. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which is a little slow here. Don't have any cheap creatures, so I think we can do better. Alright, this one is acceptable. We have a Thrall on turn 2, and then Abomination on 4, and Priest on 5. So just need to draw a 3-drop and we're good. Up against an attack with islands. Let's play a Swamp and pass. Alright, another island. Could still be multiple colors, but probably rules out 4 or 5 colors. So let's go ahead and play the Thrall, see if it gets countered or not. Just a telling time. So our opponent's gonna get to take a look at their library for 3 cards, 1 on top, 1 on the bottom, and 1 in their hand. So did not find a 3-drop yet, which is unfortunate. But we do have a bunch of 4s. Alright, blue-black. So our opponent could be on a control deck with a bunch of counter spells we need to keep in mind. So let's attack for 2. And maybe if our opponent somehow kills the Thrall, we get the Scion token, so we could already play a 4-drop if we want to. Pause a turn. So now 4 mana. So definitely expecting a counterspell from our opponent here. But let's hit for 2 first and then play out the Watcher. Since I would rather have our opponent counter the Watcher than the Abomination. And if they have a counter, they probably will counter this. Unless they have a sweeper to clear the board on their turn. Alright, so this gets countermanded. We also have to mill a bunch of creatures, which actually helps us, since we have Shadows of the Past in our deck. And also Liliana that can return creatures from the graveyard. So still keeping up 4 mana. So we'll just hit for 2. And here we could run out the Abomination. Only downside is if our opponent has a Languish, then they get to sweep our board and we aren't left with much besides a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion token. So let's see. If we pass a turn, our opponent could also just cast Inspiration to draw 2 cards, which would be bad, since we don't use our mana but our opponent uses theirs. But I still don't hate just passing the turn here. And hopefully they don't have the Inspiration. Looks like they don't. And they're also stuck on 4 mana, so probably a lot of counter spells in hand. So let's hit for 2. See if they finally try and kill the Thrall. Alright, in that case I think it's okay to run out the Husk. Get this countered. And it even gets exiled thanks to the Horribly Awry. So let's pause a turn. Opponent still stuck on 4 lands. So let's attack for 2. Don't want to get the priest countered. And again, playing the Abomination is pretty poor if our opponent has a Languish. So I think I'm content passing the turn. Looks like they finally did. Alright, they decide to complete disregard end of turn. So now we lost our pressure that we had in play. Opponent taps out for a Blight Herder. So now we get to untap and resolve something ourselves. But now our opponent does have a pretty nice board. Alright, Leap is a nice one. So we can play the Priest, play the Leap and keep up green mana. Could also play the Abomination, but that doesn't do much without any other creatures in play. Could also play the Priest, play the Leap and use Bonesplinters to kill the Blight Herder. But I think just playing Priest and then keeping up Evolutionary Leap is fine. Enchantments are pretty difficult for the opponent to remove. So the plan is to end of turn sacrifice the Priest to the Leap. But if our opponent uses a removal spell on the demon, we can also just sacrifice that in response. Does our opponent get in there? Nope. Alright, so now let's see. If we sack the Priest here and their opponent then kills our demon, that's pretty bad for us. So I think we just untap. So we have multiple green sources available, so that our opponent can't get rid of our creatures without us being able to sacrifice them to the Leap. So let's start by attacking with the demon. Force our opponent to remove it if they can. Just take 5. So we don't want to overextend into a possible sweeper here, but in blue-black Languish is the most likely, which only does -4/-4, so the demon should be safe. So let's try and bait another counter with the Abomination here. Does get spell shriveled, so we could pay for it here. Which is interesting. But that would leave us tapped out. So I think we actually let it get countered. Then we can play the Visionary and pass a turn. No need to kill the Blightherder, since our opponent is dead to the demon, so we'd rather just keep up double leap mana. Our opponent has an Ulamog, which is problematic. So now we can sacrifice the demon to the leap. See what we get. Fleshbag is ideal here. And then sacrifice the priest as well. Find a Blistterpod. Alright, so we have an answer to the Ulamog by Bonesplintering the Herder first and then casting the Fleshbag. So don't wanna block here, I believe, since we'll need our creatures to sacrifice. But we did lose our leap, which was our card advantage engine. So hopefully they don't have any more Eldrazi to follow up. So let's start by playing Blistterpod. Killing the Blightherder. And then casting the Marauder, sacrificing the Scion token. So we can still attack for 1. And I think it's okay to run out the Husk, since we can sacrifice the 2 creatures so it can outgrow a possible Languish. So now if our opponent kills one of these 2, we still have some pressure. Our opponent has Rune Processor, which is not a bad one. Gains 5 life, goes back up to 9. And now we face another problem here. From Beyond is not a bad one. So we can't really attack anymore. So let's play From Beyond and pass a turn. We can chump block the Processor for a while here. So we just have to be careful that our opponent doesn't play a second Eldrazi, so he can start attacking with multiple large creatures. Or we need to find another Bonesplinters to take care of the Processor. So I will chump block the Processor with the Visionary here, and then sacrifice it to the Husk. So if our opponent does have a Languish, it's already a 4/4. So now we untap, get a Scion token, and Bonesplinters is a nice one. But let's go to combat here. Attack for 5. And we could Bonesplinters the Processor. The downside is if our opponent just counters the Bonesplinters, we no longer have our chump blocker for the Processor, and we take 7, which starts getting a little dangerous. So I don't hate just untapping and then chumping the Processor with the Scion token. and then possibly using the Bonesplinters next turn. So again we'll sacrifice the Scion. Alright, their opponent is not attacking, but now has a Sire of Stagnation. So untap, find a Blistterpod, so we can kill one of the two Eldrazi by sacrificing our Scion token, attack with all three. Our opponent is forced to block the Husk, but then our opponent still takes 4 and is dead. So this should be game. Let's get rid of the one on the left here. Play the Blistterpod just to make sure that our Husk has enough food. And then attack with everyone. Alright. So managed to beat an Ulamog, which is not easy, but we did find the Fleshbag, which was very important there. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opening hand, which is a little slow here. Don't have any 1 or 2 drops. But we do have From Beyond and Abomination. This one is pretty close. Yeah. Let's try it, and hopefully we draw into one of our cheap creatures in the coming turns. Because we do have some of our more powerful cards in hand. It's just missing like one cheap creature. Husk is not really what we needed, but not a terrible draw either. Green-white, okay. And no turn to play. Land is good, because that means we get to play From Beyond or Abomination next turn. Running out the Husk for now, since Fleshbag doesn't do anything. And there's a Nissa's Pilgrimage, so we are up against some sort of ramp strategy. Trying to go big. I think it's a little too early to play the Abomination since we don't have any cheap creatures to sacrifice yet. So I'll just run out the From Beyond and hope our opponent doesn't have any enchantment removal. Which unfortunately green and white are some of the best colors at destroying enchantments. So we'll pause the turn, and even if our opponent destroys one of our lands, we should still be able to cast the Abomination. Instead, our opponent has Nissa, which will find a land, but now we can just run out the Fleshbag to kill Nissa. We actually have a wealth of options here. We could even consider playing Abomination and then using Bonesplinters to kill Nissa, which is actually a line I don't hate, since that'll draw us a card with the Abomination and that sacrificed the Scion token, and then on our upkeep we can just sacrifice one of the Scion tokens from Beyond to the Abomination, so make sure to keep a black mana up here. And then get the Nissa out of here. Draw a card from the Abomination. If our opponent destroys the From Beyond, then we do get punished a little bit, since then we'll have to sacrifice either the Husk to the Abomination or the Abomination to itself. But I think if our opponent had enchantment removal, our opponent would have played it instead of Nissa. We also still have Ob Nixilis and Fleshbag as removal spells, so we still have a lot of removal left. No play from the opponent. Their opponent must have a pretty expensive curve in hand. So here we can just sacrifice the Scion token and draw a card. Alright, sweet. So let's see here. We could play Ob Nixilis and then draw a card, but I also don't hate playing double Visionary here. So let's try and do that. See what we draw. Another land is fine. Play the other one. And attack with both. So now even if our opponent found an answer to From Beyond, we can still just sacrifice one of the Visionaries to the Abomination. Meanwhile our opponent is at 10. And at any point we can sacrifice a bunch of creatures to the Husk to pump it up with +2/+2 for each creature we sacrifice. So unless our opponent manages to play a sweeper this turn, I think we will be able to kill them next turn. And even if they do have a sweeper, we can just sacrifice all our creatures to the Husk to draw cards for each creature we sacrifice, thanks to the Abomination. Another Plains and a Myria Shepherd. Not the greatest stabilizer here. Just a 4/4, opponent didn't get any value out of it. So we can again sacrifice the Scion. And then we can choose if we play Fleshbag or Ob Nixilis. Let's run out Fleshbag. Sacrifice him to itself. Draw a card thanks to Abomination. Opponent has to sacrifice the Shepherd. And then we can attack for lethal. Attack with everyone. Sacrifice the Visionaries. And that's exactly 10. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which is a little slow here with Watcher and the Priest, no early plays. I think we can do better. Alright, this is fine. So we have a turn 2 Visionary, or perhaps even Shambler, turn 3 Husk, and then a Priest as a finisher. Up against the mono red deck with turn 1 a Glory Chaser. Luckily we are on the play, so we can stop it, or at least try to stop it with the Visionary. Another Shambler, not really what we want at this point. Since we would prefer to just draw Blistterpods. Alright, Call of the Full Moon means that we will take a big hit here. And unless we draw a 1-drop, we probably take a big hit next turn as well. But on turn 4 we hopefully can cast 2 Rot Shamblers in the same turn. But we are missing a second green source to do that. So perhaps we can't even play 2 spells in the same turn. But here, let's play out the Husk. We could even consider blocking with the Husk and the Visionary next turn and then sacrificing the Visionary to the Husk to trade. But if our opponent has a removal spell or a pump spell, that's pretty bad for us. So I'm not quite sure if we should do that or not. Opponent plays a Dragon Fodder. Alright, so now I don't hate going for that play. since even if our opponent does have a pump spell to save the Glory Chaser, at least we make our opponent lose the call, because our opponent will have then played 2 spells in the same turn. Could also just take it here, but going to 11 seems risky. Let's block. And then sacrifice the Visionary. Opponent does have Fire Impulse, so we do take 5 trample damage, but our opponent will lose the Call of the Full Moon at least. And now we get to play the Watcher, which can also try and double block the Glory Chaser. Next turn we get to play Shambler plus Bonesplinters, or perhaps even the Priest. Opponent gets in with everyone, so we either don't block the Glory Chaser here, could put 2 here, 1 there, or we could just block both of the tokens and not block the Glory Chaser and then just kill it with the Bonesplinters next turn, which I don't hate. So let's block the tokens. Opponent has a P and Kieran, which is annoying, but hopefully our Demon token can stop the flyers from doing too much damage. So we did draw a Forest. So we could play the Priest. Or we can play 2 Shamblers and then cast Bonesplinters on either P and Kieran or the Glory Chaser. I do like playing the 2 Shamblers here. Now the question is, do we kill P and Kieran or do we kill the Glory Chaser? I think we kill the P and Kieran and then try to block the Glory Chaser. Opponent has an Amber Hauler, so could kill one of these Shamblers right now. Let's double block. See if our opponent has a pump spell. They're gonna use an Amber Hauler, which is a mistake here, since now we'll get a 3/3 Rot Shambler, which just eats the Glory Chaser. So we just take 2 and then Foundry Street is fine. Alright, Husk is a nice one, so we have a way to sacrifice the Priest. Problem is, if we play the Priest here, we will take 2 damage from the Priest, but I think we need the Flying Blocker here. Then the question becomes, do we attack with the Rot Shambler or not? I think we do. And then just play the Priest. Then we'll have 2 blockers. We take 1 in the air if our opponent attacks, down to 6. 2 damage from the Priest, and then hopefully our opponent's last card is not an Exquisite Firecraft. Next turn we can get rid of our own Priest. Titan Strength on the unblocked one, so we take 4, go to 3, and they do have the Firecraft. Alright, too bad. So on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener. which I think is keepable, even though we're missing green mana. I'm sure we can draw into it. And we can at least play the 2 Thralls into the Marauder. So a turn 1 mountain from the opponent, but no 1-drop. Thralls are pretty good against the mono red deck, if that is what our opponent is playing. Alright, so red-white, but no turn 2 play, which is interesting, since usually red-white is a pretty aggressive color combination. So here let's just play out our Thrall. And then next turn perhaps we play the Marauder, perhaps the other Thrall. Alright, so 3 colors, but still no play. That's interesting, so they must have a removal for the Thrall here. Otherwise, I don't really know what's going on. So they get hit for 2. Let's just play out the Husk. And pause the turn. So what can our opponent be holding if they still haven't cast a single spell, but did have all their mana? Presumably. I'm not sure, maybe they're just holding a bunch of sweepers, like Radiant Flames. So there's a Gideon, but that's just gonna die to Fleshbag plus an attack. So we can play the Fleshbag, sacrifice the Fleshbag to itself, and then kill Gideon. Could also sacrifice the Thrall, and then sacrifice the Scion to the Husk to kill the Gideon. So would we rather have a Thrall or a Marauder in play? And I think I would rather have the Thrall, since we have Nantuko Husk. Go to combat, take out Gideon, and pause a turn. Next turn, if we sacrifice the Thrall, we could also play the Priest with the Scion token. Of course, we could also just draw a land. So I think our opponent is holding a bunch of sweepers, in which case we want to play out our threats one by one. And if it's a damage based sweeper, we can just sacrifice a bunch of creatures to the Husk so it doesn't die to it. So our opponent clearly has cards that they can play. Alright, runs out the Reclamation Sage just as a blocker, which is fine. And here we could play out the Priest. But again, if we're afraid of a sweeper, perhaps it's better to run out the Shadows plus perhaps another Thrall. Or just the Shadows. So if we attack with both, our opponent clearly puts the Reclamation in front of the Husk, so we do want to have another creature in play, I believe. So let's play the Shadows plus a Thrall. And then we can sacrifice the Summoning Sick Thrall to the Husk. And even get a Scry 1 out of the deal. Interesting, so our opponent blocks the Thrall instead of the Husk. And Visionary, don't really need it. I think we want to dig for a removal spell or perhaps a Planeswalker. So pause the turn. And our opponent casts a Boiling Earth. So 1 damage to each creature. Let's sacrifice the Scion in response. Ob Nixilis is a nice one to draw. And let's let the damage happen. Put Ob Nixilis on top still. Get a Scion token. And alright. So here we can play the Priest or the Ob Nixilis and draw a card. I think I like playing Ob Nixilis, since if our opponent has another sweeper, then we don't lose any more creatures. And drawing cards is never bad. Well, usually. Pause the turn. Alright, so our opponent has a Chandra, which can redirect its damage to Planeswalkers as well. But we could also just kill it right here. Opponent is at 13. I don't think we have to worry too much about the Chandra. So I think we can play the Rot Shambler. Play out the Eyeless Watcher, sacrificing the Scion token, get a Scry, grow the Rot Shambler. Don't really need more lands. And attack with the Husk. Maybe your opponent has a Celestial Flare. Alright, so this really smells like a Celestial Flare, or perhaps a Reprisal when we go to pump the Husk. So I'm not gonna do anything. If our opponent wants to block and trade, that's fine. We still have the Rot Shambler. So the trade happens, put the lands on the bottom, grow the Shambler and draw a card. Pause the turn, and next turn we can either replay a second Husk or play out the Priest. We're also getting close to ultimating the Ob Nixilis. And now we can also activate the shadows if we want to. Radiant Flames, alright. So we can sacrifice the Scion token, put the land on the bottom, and sacrifice another Scion token. Liliana can stay on top. Now we have a giant Rot Shambler. So here we have a few options. We can't quite transform Liliana unless we're willing to use Ob Nixilis to kill our own creatures, which doesn't sound great. So I probably want to wait on playing Liliana and this turn just play Husk plus Blistterpod. We also have to keep in mind that our opponent still probably has something like a Celestial Flare in hand, so perhaps we don't want to attack with just the Rot Shambler. So maybe draw a card. If we draw land, we can play Husk plus Liliana. Eyeless Watcher instead. So I think we just play Blistterpod, play Husk and pause the turn without attacking. I do think our opponent has a Celestial Flare in hand, and we can just wait a turn and not attack here. Alright, Acid Moss from the opponent is not the end of the world. And it looks like the opponent's had enough. So here we can play Liliana. And attack with everyone. And there's the Celestial Flare. So we can sacrifice Blistterpod. Put Fleshbag on top, just in case your opponent plays an Ulamog. Flip a Liliana. And I guess, let's see, we could actually just kill our opponent here, I think. Should have let the +2/+2 happen before sacrificing the other creature, just in case our opponent has a 1 mana removal spell. I want to thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this gameplay, and as always, have a nice day.